Before we dig into the 39 steps, we should more fully discuss this term that is really important to Hitchcock, a term that Hitchcock is credited for, although it didn't fully originate with him. And I did touch on it briefly in the introductory lecture, but that term, of course, is a MacGuffin. So let's flesh out a bit what a MacGuffin is. It's essentially this mysterious object or goal, usually in a spy thriller, that sets the whole chain of events into motion. And the term MacGuffin, it was coined by a screenwriter that Hitchcock worked with, a guy named Angus MacPhail. But the principle or the concept actually goes back at least as far as the writer and the poet Rudyard Kipling. And Hitchcock did acknowledge that he kind of came up with it via MacPhail, via Kipling. The key thing with the MacGuffin in terms of Hitchcock is that despite the supposed centrality of a MacGuffin in terms of the plot and character motivation, a Hitchcock movie is always about something else besides the MacGuffin. So, a key question is, what is the MacGuffin in the 39 steps? What is this mysterious object or goal that sets everything in motion? And the answer, of course, is it's these secret plans that are passed along by spies for this advanced airplane engine. And the plans are, of course, are stored in the mind of this vaudeville performer named Mr. Memory. But the film isn't really about those spies in the sense that it's about those plans. We barely learn what the plans are at the end, and we're not even maybe necessarily listening to what Mr. Memory says. We're not really even sure kind of what they mean in terms of the international or political consequences. The film really isn't interested in that. All we know is that they are important and the plot hinges on them. So, if the film is not about the MacGuffin, we can, of course, ask what is the film really about then on a basic level. I don't have a perfect answer for you on this, which is why our Zoom discussion will always be important or the discussion thread will be important. But I think at a basic level, we could say that the film is not really about those plans that Mr. Memory has. The film is more about, or even about international intrigue. The film is more about a wrongfully accused man's desperate struggle to solve a mystery so he can clear his name and live to see another day. And it's, of course, then really about his innocence and his journey to prove himself innocent. And of course, it's about the romance and the relationship that he encounters along the way. The MacGuffin in a Hitchcock plot is always very specific and very particular, almost to the point of absurdity, really. While the protagonist's motivation here, Hannah, is universal. It's something really that any human being might relate to. So the bottom line is that some of the characters in a film may care about the MacGuffin, but as an audience, we don't really care about the MacGuffin. We don't really care about the international intrigue of the plans. We care about Hannah and what's going to happen to Hannah. In his interview with Truffaut, Hitchcock explained it in this way. He says, "The main thing I've learned over the years is that the MacGuffin is nothing. I'm convinced of this, but I find it very difficult to prove it to others. My best MacGuffin, and by that I mean the emptiest and most non existent and the most absurd, is the one we used in North by Northwest." And of course, you'll find out what that is later on when we watch the film. "The picture is about espionage, and the only question that's raised in the story is to find out what the spies are after. Well, during the scene at the Chicago airport, the Central Intelligence man explains the whole situation to Cary Grant. And Cary Grant, referring to the James Mason character, asks, What does he do? What does he do? The counterintelligence man replies, Let's just say he's an importer and an exporter. But what does he sell? Oh, just government secrets, is the answer. So here you see the MacGuffin has been boiled down to its purest expression, nothing at all. So in that case, as we'll see, the film isn't really about those government secrets. It will be about Cary Grant's journey and his what happens to him along the way. And maybe the most important thing to remember about the MacGuffin is that it contains the word guff, which maybe you're familiar with. Guff essentially means a load of nonsense. So, as Bodo says, there's a lot to look for in Hitchcock's films, but watch out for the MacGuffin. It will lead you nowhere. Now, there are a number of points of discussion we could touch on in terms of the 39 steps besides just the MacGuffin. We have things like visual storytelling we could talk about. We could talk about the film's credibility or plausibility, the appearances versus reality theme, the marriage and relationships theme is quite compelling. And then also we could think a little bit about Hitchcock's framing and composition, his camera work. And I'll aim to touch quickly on each one of those, probably most on the marriage and relationships theme, which I think is really, really interesting. But first, let's talk about visual storytelling. We've been continuing to talk about Hitchcock's penchant for visual storytelling, his refusal really to rely on dialogue as far as possible, and to instead use visual means to tell a story. So, just a few instances in the film that really stood out to me where we see his visual storytelling, kind of his impulse to use visuals instead of dialogue. So there's that incident on the train with the lingerie salesman. It's a really wonderful moment where Hene, he's reading this item in the newspaper about himself. And he's suddenly very afraid because he realizes what has happened has been publicized. So, in order to show Hene's fear and paranoia, instead of giving really any dialogue, Hitchcock shows us just the salesman's slanted eyes seeming to look at Hene suspiciously. The salesman, of course, as we learn clearly, isn't suspicious at all, but the framing of the shot and our position in Hene's perspective there makes us feel the paranoia of Hene. So we know exactly what he's feeling without Hene having really to say a word. There's also that wonderful final shot, the dangling cuffs and the clasping hands at the end. It's a visual, I think, that demonstrates something about Hene and Pamela's relationship. They're no longer manacled together by these handcuffs. And there's a suggestion that because of the dangling cuffs, they may become manacled again, or there's a possibility there. But for now, that bond is clearly a choice. They're choosing to clasp hands. But we'll discuss Pamela and Hene a little bit more later. Other visual things, there's also the wonderful visual moment when Hene and Margaret are exchanging glances across the table. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner there, Margaret during the prayer. And so she sees the newspaper item, and then her fear is immediately communicated that he's the murderer. And then we get a cut to Hene, and he's kind of looking at her pleadingly, and that communicates his need for a reassurance and his kind of plea that he not be accused by Margaret of murder. And of course, that's all done completely without any dialogue at all. There's also the suspicions of Farmer John in that moment, and those are communicated not through his words, which are a prayer that we're not really paying attention to, but really through his glances and his looking back and forth between Pamela and Hene with kind of narrowed eyes. And then, of course, later on, he goes out to watch them, and we don't hear anything of what Pamela and Hene are saying as we're with the farmer, but the focus is on the farmer's suspicions, not on what Hene and Margaret are saying. As Truffaut says in the interview about this film, he says it's a beautiful illustration of silent filming. So those are just a few instances, and I'm sure that you'll remember others, but 39 Steps is just, again, so many fantastic elements of visual storytelling. Now, in the Truffaut interviews, Truffaut points out that critics often complain about credibility or plausibility in a film. And one thing we might ask is how credible or plausible is the 39 steps? That's something I'm actually curious to hear about in the Zoom discussion or in the discussion thread from you, because I think it's a fairly subjective kind of answer that you might give about plausibility or credibility. But we could ask ourselves, where might some people perhaps complain that Hitchcock is sacrificing plausibility? We might say, for example, that the swift transitions in the whole film are fairly implausible. Things move along at an almost too incredible pace. We might say things, for example, the sequence where Hene is saved by that hymn book, where saved from death. That's fairly implausible. And then after that shooting, we get this series of swift transitions that I was talking about. So we get Hene, he tells the police everything, but then they arrest him. But then somehow he breaks away from the police out the window. And then suddenly there's a parade that's going by that just happens to be going by, right? And then right after the parade, he ducks into this assembly hall where the speaker is somehow missing, and Hene himself is hustled from the parade then into this political speech. The woman says to him, "Thank goodness you're here." And somehow he's mistaken for this politician that they somehow don't know what he looks like, right? So In a way, you could say this is completely unlikely. How would these people, first of all, how would he even get hustled from the police station so quickly into the political hall? And then how would they at the political hall just mistake him for this politician? So I think we can ask, okay, this does stretch the bounds of credibility and plausibility, right? But does it matter? Uh, is there something that Hitchcock achieves instead of purely realistic plausibility? And again, I think the answer is subjective. It could change from viewer to viewer, but I do think that Hitchcock does gain at least a kind of rollicking, maybe pure emotion instead of strict plausibility. And because of the pace, we're really constantly on edge, wondering what will happen next to our character, rather than worrying about the practicalities. This is another thing that I think you'll see in North by Northwest. It's a very fast-paced film once it gets going, and some things are completely and totally impractical, and yet they're really, really wonderful as we're caught up in the emotion. Hitchcock himself says, the insistence that a storyteller stick to the facts is just as ridiculous as to demand of a representative painter that he show objects accurately. So, in other words, I think he's saying that a filmmaker can be like a painter who offers a representation of something, not necessarily the thing itself. And the representation, as it's rendered by the painter, can draw out different things, different colors, different emotions than what we might see in real life. And we see more than we might see otherwise into the life of things with that representation than we would if the painter were strictly aiming for kind of photorealism. Hitchcock has said he doesn't want this slice of life, quote unquote. He also doesn't want, though, kind of out and out fantasy. Slice of life, he feels people can get at home. Why would you go to the theater to get a slice of life? There's, of course, an argument to be made to slice of life films, but moving on from that, he also says fantasy doesn't offer characters to identify with. And again, I think that's up for interpretation. But Hitchcock is aiming for something that's not slice of life, but also not pure fantasy. What his goal is, and I think we'll see this throughout his career, is that making a film means, first of all, to tell a story, to never be banal, but always to be both dramatic and human, offering maximum impact by technical achievement. And I suppose the question for us as viewers is to really consider whether we feel that he achieves that impact, whether he achieves that something dramatic, but also something that is very human as well. Now, I think there are a couple of key thematic threads in the film that we can pursue that are really, really interesting. One of them has to do with this theme of appearances versus reality, tying to the whole element of spies and false identities and the place of theater in the film, and theater and acting in the film. And then another one of those threads has to do with marriage and relationships. As the really wonderful Hitchcock scholar Robin Wood has said, the film is or this is what he thinks about the film. He says that the film is a spy plot that is a cover for the film's real concerns with gender relations and sexuality. And he says the film is a comprehensive survey of the possibilities of heterosexual relationships under the patriarchy. Now, Wood's idea there, or his claim, I think is certainly not something that we might see right away in the film, but it's definitely worth teasing out because it is quite a provocative claim for Wood to make, that this rollicking spy film is somehow about heterosexual relationships under the patriarchy. Let's not get there quite yet, though. Let's start with the theme of appearances versus reality and talk about that. So, these are just a few instances in the film where I think we can see things that are tying to that theme of appearances versus reality, that whole idea that things are not as they appear, that the reality does not match the appearance. So, first of all, the film opens and closes with scenes set in the theater. So, the whole venue of the theater is quite interesting. But then by the last scene, that which separates the world of the stage from the world of the film, that invisible line between theater and reality, stage and audience, is destroyed. It's important to note that Mr. Memory, this person who's been assumed to be merely a part of an entertaining show, is actually integral to the nation as a keeper of secrets. And the theater setting in that final scene literally has real consequences. It's not just a theater anymore. And then what Mr. Memory says on the stage leads to his being really shot by someone, notably from the audience, of course, the professor. So real life takes precedence over play acting in a way, or rather, real life and play acting merge until they can't really be distinguished anymore. And the scene closes then with these chorus girls kicking up their legs in the background and Hannah and Pamela clasping hands. And I think we're invited to consider when the theatrical and the real might merge again. We also, of course, have that wonderful incident on the political stage where Hannah appears to be a real politician and he somehow convinces everyone that he's a politician, but of course he's not. He's merely acting like one, of course. But what's notable, too, of course, is he's actually trying to tell some version of the truth, but they can't really hear what he's saying because they assume that he is what he appears to be, a politician. Though, again, of course, even though he's not, he's a man on the run. Another example, John the farmer is an interesting element. He, I'm sure, for all intents and purposes, from the perspective of the people around him, he is this upright, upstanding citizen. He is a puritanical religious person who seems to stand for things like family values, perhaps. Yet in reality, he's a jealous husband who beats his wife. Another example, of course, is the professor. He is this very suave example of kind of upper class respectability. He's super civilized, and his family even goes to church on Sundays, and he hobnobs with all the law enforcement, but he's actually a criminal and a murderer. And then, of course, back to Hannah himself, he's mistaken for a criminal through the entire film, but he also goes through this array of shifting identities, of appearing to be something he's not. He's alternately a milkman. He dresses up as a milkman. He says he's a mechanic at one point. He, of course, plays a politician. He plays a villain for Pamela when he spins this whole tale for her about his childhood. He plays a married man when they go to the inn. He's almost never what he appears to be in the film, although the stakes are very real. The stakes are really life and death. Just a couple of quick examples too. We have characters like Annabella. She is mistaken by Hannah actually for a sex worker. I don't know if you caught that, but she's kind of mistaken for someone who's going to be a one night stand for Hannah in the very beginning. She says to him, "I'm not that kind of actress." And that is sort of a subtle line there that is essentially letting us know that Hannah is kind of mistaken her for being like a sex worker or one night stand. But of course, she isn't. She's an important spy on a mission. And then, of course, we have Mr. Memory. He appears to be this innocent showman, right? But he's actually a courier for secret government information. But then in the end, there's sort of another twist where appearances are reversed again, and we realize that he's actually quite innocent himself. And he was just being used and abused by the real criminals. So there's a sort of a double mistake about Mr. Memory. He appears to be just an entertainer, and then he appears to be a dastardly person involved in this spy plot. And then we realize actually he's quite an innocent man caught up in something that is bigger than himself. So, in terms of this theme, appearances and reality, we might ask ourselves, what is the significance of that, and why is Hitchcock interested in it? I don't actually have a definitive answer for you, and I think that's one of the tantalizing things about Hitchcock's films. But I find the theme really fascinating, and I will look forward to perhaps hearing what your own musings are about the significance of appearance and versus reality and why you think Hitchcock is interested in it as we go along in the quarter and as we encounter more of this theme in Hitchcock's films. It's definitely going to come back in something like North by Northwest, but I would argue that it is on some level in all of his films. So, this other major thematic thread that I mentioned has to do with marriage and relationships. And again, just to give you Robin Wood's iteration of it here, he says the film's spy plot is a cover for the film's real concerns with gender relations and sexuality. And the film is a comprehensive survey of the possibilities of heterosexual relationships under the patriarchy. So, if Robin Wood is right, we might ask, what are these significant relationships, or what are the mentions of relationships that we see in the film? These relationships between men and women. So, let's just kind of list some of them. Some of them are just sort of offhand, but I think they're notable in the context of the whole. So, we have this wife in the very beginning in scene in the theater. She wants to know from Mr. Memory where her husband is. Then we have the milkman, this encounter that Hannah has with the milkman talking about his wife. And when Hannah asks if he's married, the milkman says, "Don't rub it in." Then we have this brief relationship between Hannah and Annabella, the spy, a definite kind of heterosexual relationship. We also have the lingerie salesman talking about his wife, kind of while he's looking at this women's underwear that he has in his suitcase or whatever. He says, "My wife, burr," right, as if to say, "My wife is cold." We have, of course, Hene and Pamela. He accosts her on the train. That's their first encounter. And then later at the political rally, she gives him up to the police. And then they're manacled together against their will. And then, of course, they fall in love at the end. Talk about them more in a bit. We also have a Professor Jordan and his wife, quite an interesting relationship, sort of a brief glimpse into their marriage, but it's quite interesting what we do see. And then we have the farmer John and his poor abused wife Margaret. We also have the innkeeper and his wife, kind of a small role, but also I think quite a warm depiction. They are of course very excited, especially the wife is very excited to have this young couple staying in their inn or their pub. So there does clearly seem to be this repeating pattern of heterosexual relationships in the film. And we might look at, there are some really interesting parallels or mirroring relationships that we can compare and contrast to kind of see perhaps what is Hitchcock exploring about these marriage and relationships. So for example, if we compare the scenes between Hene and Annabella and Hene and the farmer's wife, Margaret, there are some quite significant provocative similarities between the two things. And I'm actually getting this parallels from an essay by Charles Sillett in A Hitchcock Reader, the book. So if you're interested in reading the whole essay, I can get it to you. But let me just tease it out for you a little bit. So if we look at the parallels between Hene and Annabella and Hene and Margaret, so there's this implication that Hene's life has been quite dull or rather dull until he meets Annabella, and then it gets exciting. And then there's the implication on the other side that Margaret's life had been quite dull until she met Hene. She was longing for Glasgow, as she said. Then there's a meal that's our meal parallel between the two relationships. We have a fish meal that's prepared by Hene to help the needy Annabella when she comes to his home. And then there's another fish meal that's prepared by Margaret to help Hene when he comes to her home. Then there's a kind of a similar need of danger, or there's a similar danger and a need for protection between both. Annabella, of course, is in danger and Hene protects her. And then in the other case, Hene is in danger and Margaret protects Hene. Then there's this sexual component or this undercurrent in both of them. Hene suspects at first, of course, that Annabella is seeking a one night stand, even though she isn't. And then the farmer suspects that Margaret and Hene have some kind of sexual liaison going on, even though, of course, they don't. And then also Hene offers Annabella a bed for the night. Margaret offers Hene a bed for the night. And then both times, Hene is awakened by the women and sent on his way. In one case, there's this dangerous mission that Hene is going on. And then the other case, the woman helps him on this same mission. So it's kind of a very odd, strange parallel, right? We have Annabella and Margaret, who are two supporting characters. And yet, because of their significance to Hene, they are quite important. And the parallel between the two relationships seems interesting too. So we might ask, why would Hitchcock set up this parallel? What is the significance of the parallel? And I think one thing we might consider is that there's actually kind of a gender role switch that happens between the Annabella Hene moment and the Hene Margaret moment. Hene ultimately plays both kinds of what you might call typical gender roles. So in one case, he's the host with Annabella, and then he becomes the guest with Margaret. And in the one case, he plays the kind of aggressive, protective role, and as with Annabella, and then he becomes the passive role when he is sort of protected by Margaret. And I think we might consider the idea that passivity might typically be gendered as female, and sort of like protective might be typically gendered as male, but Hene plays both sides. So Hitchcock is perhaps inviting us to think about gender roles and kind of the typical gender relationships that we might see. And we might think about what's the equality level in each of the relationships that we see in the film, and also who is best suited as sort of the dominant figure in relationships. And should there be a dominant figure in kind of a heterosexual relationship? Now, when we think about the pairing of Hene and Annabella, we can also kind of think about the pairing of Farmer John and his wife Margaret, and consider how those two relationships compare in terms of that question of equality and in terms of the question of which is the healthy relationships in terms of how we kind of see dominance or non-dominance. So with Hene and Annabella, even though they're really only together a brief time, I think we see a kind of mutual gratification between them, a kind of camaraderie and trust and equality. We also see a hint of a sexual liaison, which is clearly, again, what Hene thinks is it is at first. So in a way, he's embracing this idea of a sexual relationship without commitment with Annabella. And then if we look at Farmer John and his wife Margaret, there is certainly a sexual relationship there, but it comes with commitment. But we also see the worst aspects of a traditional marriage, this woman dominated and abused by her husband, so kind of a total lack of equality and this misery. And both of them are quite miserable, of course. Margaret, of course, is the most miserable, but even the husband who is dominating things seems miserable, consumed by his own jealousy and his hatred. So, kind of given all of that, now we have to kind of figure out how Hene and Pamela fit into those pairings, into that question of equality and relationships and roles. And it is, of course, the final relationship the film leaves us with. So, where do Hene and Pamela fit into this pattern of all these couples that we've seen? What kind of couple are they? In a way, their relationship is defined by negatives. Their relationship, it's not a one night stand. Their relationship is not characterized by brutal domination. And it's certainly not, at least yet, a traditional marriage kind of family relationship either. So, in light of this, we might ask actually a little bit more about Hene himself and maybe even thinking about typically rendered gendered roles. So, how typically masculine is Hene? I think we can actually argue that in some ways he's not typically masculine. He does start out in terms of his relationship to Pamela by accosting her and kissing her, right? But that really backfires on him. She definitely does not fall for him because of that kiss, as women might traditionally do in a romantic film. And Hene, in fact, so that like kind of traditionally masculine type of aggressive role backfires on him. And then we might look at some other things about Hene that actually kind of might be typically rendered or considered feminine in a sort of, very typical traditional way. So for example, his gun isn't a gun, it's only a pipe that he's faking is a gun. He is someone who accepts help from women. He accepts being protected by women. He's saved by a hymn book when he's shot rather than by any aggressive violence or fighting back. And then last and maybe most notably, Pamela escapes the handcuffs that she's been forced to be with Hene, and she then chooses independently to stay with him. So she independently accepts the fact of his innocence, right? And when Hene wakes up and finds that she's gone, he actually accepts her choice of freedom. Although he's very happy when she comes back, but he doesn't try to go after her and bind her to himself again. So Robin Wood says in this film, we can kind of see maybe what we might call kind of a tentative progress toward independent mutual commitment and equality. Pamela can fight back, Hene can fight back, but they actually also kind of take care of each other too. It's this sort of mutually giving and receiving sort of a relationship. And then, of course, we get that final shot that we've alluded to already, kind of what it is and what does it tell us about Hene and Pamela. Just in terms of the shot itself, we've just seen Mr. Memory, and he kind of is in the background there. He's been fatally wounded. He's getting this secret off his chest. And in the foreground, we have Hene and Pamela. And then in the next iteration of the shot, in the background, we have these chorus girls. And we have centered in the final shot this close up on clasping hands and that dangling handcuffs. Robin Wood writes that the world of the music hall is now pushed to the back of the memory, and the final shot dramatizes that favorite culmination of classical cinema, the construction of the heterosexual couple. But I think we can ask, and Robin Wood invites us to ask, are they the same as every construction that we've seen in classical cinema? Based on the story we've seen, with the suggestion that other kinds of relationships are possible, Wood believes that perhaps Pamela and Hene might have the potential to be freed from what he calls the oppressive restraints of patriarchy. Although he cautions, he says, the handcuffs are still there. The handcuffs remain, a bit of a kind of ominous symbol in the midst of the potential for equality. Wood says, although the handcuffs no longer bind the couple, they are still dangling from Hene's wrist. So, something to continue to think about the marriage and relationships of this film. Again, it's a rollicking spy film, but the film is certainly has a lot of heterosexual relationships in the film. And I think we could argue that Hene and Pamela are quite a bit different than many typically rendered couples that we see in films, even films today. Just a few final things to note about this film, which, as David Cairns, a Scottish writer and filmmaker, notes in his Criterion Collection essay about the film, that 39 Steps really does represent so many Hitchcock motifs and choices, particularly in terms of his camera use. We see his camera and its idiosyncratic ways of framing and composing images. And Cairns notes, all of the director's famous cinematic gestures are present in the 39 steps. So, for example, we see these high angle shots, which we haven't seen too much of yet in The Lodger and Blackmail, but we'll continue to see more of as we watch more of his films. So we have these high angle shots, such as Hannity's view of the abyss from that pillar of the bridge there. And abysses are kind of classic in Hitchcock. They're really, really memorable, especially we're going to see them in things like Vertigo and North by Northwest. We also see Hitchcock's beautiful tendency to offer these dramatically juxtaposed shots. So there's that famous sound bridge there on the bottom two shots on your screen, where that's quite a famous sound bridge where you have the image of the cleaning lady and then this cut to the train, and it's quite a sharp cut and just a beautiful juxtaposition of images. And then we also see things like the deliberate and meaningful reverse shot sequences. It's most notable in this dinner table scene here that we've seen. We have the shot of Margaret and the shot of Hene and back to Margaret and back to Hene. And then we have the shot to the farmer, kind of a beautiful sequence of juxtapositions of shots there. We also have these really significant point of view shots that are quite prevalent in the film as well. And I think more than we've seen yet. We didn't see them as much in The Lodger or Blackmail, but we're going to continue to see them even more in the films as we go on. So the 39 steps with these kind of POV shots can be, David Cairns says, a way to understand just film's capacity and gender in general to render human subjectivity, this whole idea that we can see through the subjective human point of view with the camera. So in this film, for example, we have that voyeur shot we noted previously where the farmer is looking through the window at Margaret and Hene. We have that really wonderful shot too, the point of view through opera glasses on the top right-hand corner there where we see Mr. Memory. We also have, of course, this shot on the bridge where we're in Hene's perspective looking down. It's not just an abyss, but it's Hene's perspective on an abyss. And then, of course, we have things like the political rally where we have Hene's point of view and he's coming into this rally where everyone is looking at him. So Hitchcock's ability to put us within the film and the film's subjective viewpoint is really one of his strengths, and we'll see that gaining more and more as we go along. And it's in part, I think, what makes his films so very suspenseful, but it's also what forces us to consider the ideological and thematic implications of his films.